my grandfather Earl was a trade union activist in Wichita, Kansas. And he was so good at organizing the trade unions that in 1927, the Russians said, if you like trade unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Moscow? So Earl Browder, my grandfather, went to Moscow. And he did what a lot of young American men do in Moscow. He met a Russian girl who became my grandmother. And my father was born in Moscow. And then he had done so well inside the Communist Party that they sent him back to America in 1932, and Earl Browder became the General Secretary of the American Communist Party for the next 15 years. My grandfather ran for president twice on the communist ticket in 36 and 40 against Roosevelt. He was then imprisoned for being a communist in 1941, and then he was expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too capitalist. But that didn't help him 5 years later. When McCarthy came around, it didn't matter whether you were a good communist or a bad communist, you were still a communist, and he was then persecuted and had to sit in front of the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities for many months on end, testifying about his communist role. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964, and when I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, as I was rebelling against my family, I said to myself, what's the best way to rebel against a family of communists? Well, I figured it out. I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist. There was nothing I could do that would upset my family more than that. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And most people in business school, the purpose of going to business school is to get your first job out of business school. And so as I was trying to figure out what first job should I get, none of the jobs that were on offer in business school appealed to me. And as I was searching my soul for the right job and the right career, I had an epiphany, which was, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to go become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do. So fast forward a few years, Russia, Boris Yeltsin, so the Soviet Union had split apart. Boris Yeltsin becomes the head, and he says, I want to make this country no longer communist. I want this country to be a capitalist country. And so he came up with this interesting idea, which was to make a capitalist country, you can't just declare yourself capitalist, you actually have to make people property owners. And so they embarked on something called the mass privatization program, where they were going to give away all the state property to the people for free, and then everyone would have an interest in capitalism, or so he thought. Well, as you all know, it didn't turn out quite the way it had been planned. Instead of the whole country getting all the assets, 22 oligarchs ended up with 40% of the country, and the rest of the people in Russia lived in poverty. But there were still crumbs falling off the tables. And the crumbs that I discovered falling off the table was the crumbs of shares of Russian companies. You could buy shares of companies like Lukoil, the big oil company, or Gazprom, or the electricity company. And I did the math back then, and you could buy these shares at a 99.7% discount to the value of shares in the West. And interestingly, nobody else did this math, and I don't know exactly why, but I did this math, and I figured that sure, it was a risky place, sure, it was a terrible place, sure, it was a corrupt place, but if you're buying at a 99.7% discount, there's really not that much further down it can go. And if for some reason Russia doesn't disintegrate into nothing, and maybe it goes from horrible, which is what it was then, to very bad, then it goes to, let's say, a 90% discount, and you can make many multiples on your money. And so on the basis of this simple analysis, which I've just shared with you, I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund to invest in the Russian stock market. And we started buying shares I moved to Moscow in 1996. We started buying shares. And my fund grew from almost nothing to eventually becoming the largest investment fund in Russia with $4.5 billion of assets under management. And so I actually succeeded in this goal of mine to becoming the largest capitalist of some sort in Russia. Now, this was all very exciting and good to be managing all this money, but as I got to know the country, I realized that these companies that I was investing in, I might have owned shares of the companies, but I didn't really own a share of anything, because the oligarchs, the majority shareholders of these companies, were stealing all the money for themselves. Even if they owned 50% of the company, they would steal 100% of the profits, and then the assets, and then some. And so I was sitting there with a big responsibility, managing all these other people's money, and there was all this stealing going on right in front of my face, and the stealing was really, really brazen. There was a case where we discovered that Gazprom, the big gas company, that the management of Gazprom, 9 guys between 1996 and 1999 had stolen oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait off the balance sheet of Gazprom. I'm not exaggerating. We did the analysis. I could show you the size of Kuwait. Now, the other thing we discovered about Gazprom is that the size of Kuwait only represented 9% of the reserves of Gazprom, and so 90% of the stuff was still on the balance sheet. In any case, what we decided to do with all this stealing was I couldn't go to the police and say, can you arrest these people for stealing, because the Russian police were not honest. And I couldn't go to the politicians and say, how can you allow this to happen, because the politicians were in on the action in a small way. And so I came up with this idea of doing what we coined the word stealing analysis, of how they went about doing the stealing. And that was something that was in my power and my ability to do. And then I could share the stealing analysis with the international media. And there were lots of journalists in Moscow that loved me because I could save them 3 months' worth of work by sharing with them my stealing analysis. And so we started this process of doing this research, publicizing it, and then seeing what would happen. And amazingly, when we publicized the stealing, what would happen was that the government would wake up and step in after the scandal broke, and the president or the government would then cancel or in some fire someone or in some way stop the stealing. And so as a result of this naming and shaming campaign, we were able to, I wouldn't say eliminate the stealing still went on, but we were able to curtail some of the stealing, and the value of my shares went up quite considerably. And so I really had the perfect job. I was making money for my clients, making money for myself, and getting the bad guys, and I would say improving Russia. Now you may ask yourself, how is it that exposing corruption in Russia stopped any stealing? Aren't they just all corrupt? And the answer is that when I started doing this, I had a strange alignment of interests with none other than Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin had come to power as a prime minister in 1999, and he became president in year 2000. And he had the same set of enemies as me. The Russian oligarchs were stealing power from him at the same time they were stealing money from me. So when he came to power, the one thing he wanted to do was to stop them from stealing his power. And so every time I would publicize one of these scandals, he would step in. And as a result, I lived this charmed life for about 4 years. But it was really too good to be true. In late 2003, as I was running on my treadmill in my study at home, I was watching CNN, and I saw that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos, the richest man in Russia, had been arrested. And he had been arrested, and we all thought that a rich guy, they'd have to let him out of jail after a day or two, because rich guys never stay in jail. There must be some kind of, he didn't pay a big enough bribe or something. But after a day or two, he was still in jail, and after a week or two, he was still in jail, and after a month or two, he was still in jail. And then Putin put him on trial in June of 2004. And Putin did something which was unusual. They allowed the television cameras to come into the courtroom to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And this had a very powerful psychological effect on the other rich guys in Russia. Imagine that you're the 17th richest oligarch in Russia, and you're on your yacht parked off the Hotel du Cap in Antibes, and you come out of your bedroom and you flick on the television station on the CNN, and you see the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? Well, not to sit in a cage. And so one by one, the oligarchs went back to Putin at the end of the summer of 2004 and said, Vladimir Vladimirovich, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage? And he said, very simple, 2 words, 50%. Not 50% to the Russian government or 50% to the presidential administration of Russia, 50% to Vladimir Putin. Now, I wasn't witnessing these meetings. It could have been 30%, could have been 70%. But what I can say for sure is that after that summer, the oligarchs became Putin's business partners, and Putin was no longer fighting with them. He was treating them much, much more favorably. And I hadn't read the tea leaves properly, and so instead of seeing how the tides had changed, I was carrying on with my naming and shaming campaigns. And as I was flying back to Moscow in November of 2005, after a weekend trip to London, I was coming to Sheremetyevo 2 airport. I went to the VIP lounge. What should have been a 5-minute ordeal getting my, or a 5-minute exercise getting my passport stamped turned into a 45-minute situation. And then 4 guards entered the VIP lounge, grabbed me, and escorted me down to the detention center of the airport. They locked me up. They kept me there for 15 hours. And then they frog-marched me onto a plane to go back to London and deported me from Russia. Several days later, we received a formal notification from the Foreign Ministry of Russia that I'd been declared a threat to national security. When the Russians turn on you, they don't do so mildly. They turn on you with extreme prejudice. And I knew that this wasn't the end of my troubles. This was the beginning of my troubles. And I said to myself, what do I have to do to protect myself from the Russian authorities? And there were 2 things that I had that they could have taken. One was they could have arrested my people, and the second is they could have seized my assets. And so I evacuated my staff as quickly as I could, and then I sold all the securities that we held in Russia so they couldn't seize them or take them away. And once I was finished getting my people out and getting the money out, I dusted off my hands and I said to myself, phew, there's nothing more they can do. That was scary, but I'm out, got everyone out, got the money out. I'm finished with Russia. It turned out that maybe I was finished with Russia, but Russia was just getting started with me. 18 months later, 25 police officers raided my office in Moscow. I kept an office there in case this story ever changed. I had 1 secretary, that was all. 25 more officers raided the office of an American law firm that I used. And they were specifically looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for the investment holding companies through which I had invested my money in Russia. They seized those documents, and then the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. They had been fraudulently transferred out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of murder and let out of jail early by the Interior Ministry. At this point, I became very concerned. There was no money at risk because we got our money out, but the fact that the police were involved in this highly complex financial scam worried me tremendously, and we went out and hired a bunch of lawyers, including a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei at the time was 35 years old, and he was the cleverest lawyer in Moscow. and I thought to myself, I need somebody smart who can help me figure this out. And he went and did the research to figure out what they were up to. And he came back with two conclusions of what they were trying to do. The first was that they were trying to steal my assets. But as I just mentioned to you, we got all of our money out, and so they didn't succeed in that. But the second thing that Sergei figured out was the most cynical thing that he had ever seen, which was that when we were liquidating all of our assets, we had a large profit, and we paid $230 million of taxes in the previous year. And what Sergei discovered was that this group of corrupt police officers went back to the tax authorities in December of 2007, on the 23rd of December 2007 to be exact, and applied for a $230 million tax refund from the government to our stolen companies. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas, and it was awarded the next day, no questions asked. The largest tax refund in the history of Russia paid out on Christmas Eve. We were certain this must be a rogue operation. How can Vladimir Putin allow, sure, he can steal from foreigners, but how can he allow this to happen to his own country's money? It wasn't my money that was stolen, it was the Russian government's money. And so we decided that if it was a rogue operation, we should expose it. And we wrote criminal complaints to every different branch of Russian law enforcement, and we publicized what had happened. And we expected the good guys to get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. Well, it turned out that there were no good guys. Instead of opening a criminal case against the bad guys, the police opened criminal cases against all of our lawyers. And at this point, we had 7 lawyers working for us from 4 different law firms, including Sergei Magnitsky. As soon as they opened these criminal cases, I became terrified for my lawyers, and I asked every one of them to leave Russia, come to London at my expense, stay in London at my expense to get out of harm's way. It wasn't an easy conversation to have with any of them, and it took a while, but 6 of the 7 lawyers left Russia. The only one who wouldn't leave was Sergei. Sergei was about 10 years younger than the rest of the lawyers. He wasn't fully conscious of the evil of the Soviet era. And he had this, what I would describe as stubborn idealism. He said, I've not done anything wrong. There's no law, I've not broken the law. I can stay here and the law will protect me. And so he stayed. And not only did he just stay, but he went and testified against the police officers involved in this scam. He testified against them in October of 2008. And 1 month later, on the 24th of November 2008, the same officers he testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and 2 children, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day. They put him in cells with no heat, no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They moved him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of all this mistreatment was to try to get him to withdraw his testimony and then to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million and he did so at my instruction. And none of us know how we would behave under such pressure. I don't know how I would behave. I don't think Sergei knew how he would behave in advance. I don't think any of you would know how you'd behave when put under that kind of pressure. But amazingly, for Sergei, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more poisonous and more painful than the idea of the terrible pressure that they were putting him under. And he refused. He refused, and the conditions just kept on getting worse and worse and worse for him. He ended up losing 20 kilos, developing severe pains in his stomach, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation. On the 1st of August, 2009, he was supposed to have an operation, but instead of operating on him, they came to him again with this Faustian bargain of signing this false confession. And Sergei again refused. And so instead of operating on him, they abruptly moved him from a prison that had medical facilities to a prison called Butyrka, which is a maximum security prison one of the toughest and most awful prisons in Russia, and most significantly for Sergei, a prison without any proper medical facilities. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant agonizing pain, needing medical treatment, and they refused. They consistently refused all of his requests for medical treatment. He applied in writing, he and his lawyer applied in writing on 20 different occasions for medical treatment to 20 different recipients. Every single one of his requests was either ignored or rejected. Finally, his body could no longer take it, and on the night of November 16, 2009, he went into critical condition. On that night, the prison authorities at Butyrka decided to move him back to a prison that had the medical center called Matroshka Tishina. They put him in an ambulance to go to Matroshka Tishina, but when the ambulance arrived there, instead of putting him in the emergency room, the guards put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and then 8 riot guards with rubber batons came in and beat him to death that night. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got this news the next morning. At 7:30 in the morning on the 17th of November 2009, my phone rang, and it was my another Russian lawyer calling to tell me that Sergei Magnitsky had been killed. And it's indescribable, the physical pain that I felt from Sergei's death. Sergei wouldn't have been killed if he hadn't been my lawyer. He had been taken hostage and tortured to death because he was my lawyer. And it was the most heartbreaking experience I've ever had in my life. And I made a vow on that morning, then and there, that I wasn't going to let the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky get away with it. And this case was unusual in one very serious respect, in that Sergei Magnitsky had documented everything that happened to him. He wrote 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention, telling what had happened to him, all the abuse, who did what to him, when, how, where, and why. And we had copies of every one of those complaints. And even though the Russians never acted on them, they allowed them to be filed, and because they were filed, they were effectively official testimony from the grave of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. This became the most well-documented human rights abuse case that came out of Russia in the last 35 years. And we expected, because it was so well-documented, that the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, no matter how corrupt Russia was, would have to face justice. They'd have to throw a few of their own guys under the bus. But they decided instead to circle the wagons completely and absolutely and exonerate every single person involved. And some of the most complicit were given special state honors and promotions. There were only 2 people ever prosecuted in this story. Sergei Magnitsky himself, 3 years after he died, in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia, and me as his co-defendant. In July of 2013, they held the trial. It was a multi-month trial with prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, guards. The only people that weren't there were the defendants. One was dead and one was in England. And they found us both guilty. I was sentenced to 9 years in absentia. Throughout this whole process, it became clear to me that if we weren't going to get justice in Russia, then we're going to get justice outside of Russia. And we weren't going to get these people for torture and murder because there's no jurisdiction for torture and murder outside of Russia. However, the people who did this crime did it for money. They did it to steal $230 million. And so we said to ourselves, those people don't like to keep their money in Russia. They like to keep it in the West where it's safe. They like to travel to the West where they can go on vacation. They like to send their kids to private school in the West. And so I went to Washington, and I went to a number of senators in Washington, and I told them the same story I've just told you. And I said, how about we take away these people's visas and freeze their assets? And there's not many things that people in Washington could agree on, but this was one of the few things they could. And I ended up getting a senator named Benjamin Cardin, who's a Democrat from Maryland, and another senator who you've all heard of, Senator John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, to jointly sponsor the Sergei Magnitsky Act. And the Sergei Magnitsky Act first started out with just just to go after Sergei's killers and sanction them. But when it was launched, so many other victims of human rights abuse in Russia came forward and went to these senators and said, "You found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. This is what they care about. Their money is in the West." And as a result of that, these senators realized that they're onto something much bigger than just one case, that they found a tool, the modern-day tool, to deal with this terrible stuff going on in Russia. And so they added 65 words to the law to say that they weren't just going to sanction Sergei's killers, but they're going to sanction all other gross human rights abusers in Russia. And it quickly started to snowball. And in November of 2012, it went for a vote in the Senate, and the Senate passed it 92-4. It went for a vote in the House of Representatives. It passed 89%. And President Obama, who at the time had been trying to appease Russia with something called the reset policy, was forced, based on the Constitution of America, because there was no way he could veto this, to sign the Sergei Magnitsky law, or act into law. And there are now 34 people on the Sergei Magnitsky list who have been sanctioned. They're on the federal OFAC sanctions list, which means that they can't open a bank account anywhere in the world and have their assets frozen in America. And this just absolutely terrified Putin. And as a result and the reason it terrified Putin is even if the 34 guys on the list are not that high level, he understands that this can be used against him. And guess what happened? After the invasion of Crimea, they used the same exact tool on all of his people. And this is now one of the main tools that we can use other than go to war with Russia to hit them where it counts. So to finish off, so we've passed this law, and the law is part of what I call my political thread or prong to this campaign. We also have a criminal justice prong to this campaign, which is going after getting the law enforcement agencies of different countries to freeze and seize the assets of the bad guys who have that money, have that $230 million, going specifically after the $230 million. We've actually been investigating it for 5 years and have found out where about 200 of the 230 has gone. And so far, the Swiss prosecutors have frozen about $20 million. The US prosecutors have frozen $15 million. And there's a bunch of other criminal cases going on as we speak. And this really upsets the bad guys. And then the third prong of this whole thing is telling the story. And at first I thought I could just tell the story through the newspapers and I would get people to pay attention. And I realized after working with a lot of journalists that even if I'm fortunate enough to get their attention and they write a story, not that many people read the papers. And of the people who read the papers, oftentimes they don't read the article that I worked so hard on getting into the papers. And if they did, they probably spent about 45 seconds on it. And I thought to myself, if I could get people for a really long time to tell the story, then I might be able to really move them in terms of understanding what's going on in Russia and how horrible it all is. And so I said to myself, if I can write a book, I get people for 10 hours. And now, you get them for 10 hours sometimes, but not always. And I know from my own personal experience, I've got 20 books stacked next to my bed that I've read 30 pages of, and then I stop. And I said to myself, if I'm going to write this book, I don't want my book to be one of those books that people only read 30 pages of. And so I killed myself writing this book to make sure that everybody read this book to the end. And I can absolutely guarantee you that if you read the first 10 pages of this book, you will read this book to the end. It grabs you by the scruff of your neck, and you will read it to the end. And you'll be moved by this book. You'll be entertained, you'll be angered, and you'll be moved. And so this is my sort of intermediate step in my campaign for justice. And the final step is that is when I finish this book tour, is we start working on the Hollywood movie. Now I can't tell you who's going to play me, but this movie will get made in the same way as this law got passed, and 20 million people will hear this story and will be able to tell all their friends about it, and hopefully that will change people's opinion of what's going on in Russia. Thank you very much.